So I want to start this conversation with something we've been thinking a lot about in the past, which is this idea that you can really do anything if you're able to align the incentives of people, of organizations, and so on. And in a way, the 20th century was about, everything that people kind of did was related to solving all diseases in a way. And the 21st century seems to be a century that will be remembered as a century of coordinations. So given that context, given what you've learned in your research, do you have any thoughts on how we can best align the incentives to either create projects that you wouldn't normally have been able to, or really think deeply about this question?
Mm-hmm. Well, I can answer that question by drawing on our research on honeybees, and that in that context, it's very instructive to look at incentives in a honeybee colony and compare and contrast them to what goes on in human society. So in a honeybee society, there is a very strong alignment of interests. In the case of honeybees, the alignment of interests is genetic or familial. The individuals are closely related to each other, and it's really wired into their DNA that their fate depends on cooperating, on working together. And if they work together and support the queen, who is related to them, then the queen can have lots of babies, and there can be lots of other bees, and then the society can prosper. So in that case, in the case of honeybees, the alignment and the incentive structure is simple in the sense that it's based on working together, helping your relatives. In the human society, things get more complex and therefore more interesting in some ways, because whereas in human evolution we do strongly suspect that there was a time when that was the primary form of social organization, that meaning kinship, familial groups, we also know that humans have gone way beyond that, and we have social structures, organizations, academic, private, corporate, that go beyond relatedness, that rely upon bonds that are created among individuals based on other kinds of shared interests. And so how does one create a situation, and how do people in groups create situations where interests are aligned so that cooperation can be facilitated? And how is it possible to get people to see that? And basically the lesson is that the bigger the group, the more difficult that is, that it's harder to find those commonalities. That doesn't mean we shouldn't be trying and working hard to do so, because while it might be easier to see that the fate of an individual bee in a colony depends on the success of its colony, that's certainly the case for humans, that the success of an individual and the fate of each individual on this planet really depends on some levels of cooperation. But it's much harder to see that in practice.
Is this genetic factor more conscious in bees, or is it just, it's like natural, like blinking your eye or something? Is it hardwired like that, or is it something that they think of consciously when doing these actions?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question, and that's always the sort of $50 million question in animal behavior. And so I can give a couple answers. The first and simple answer is that we don't know, but the more elaborate answer is that what the approach one generally takes is to be mindful of the idea that in science you try to explain something as simply as possible. And if that works, then you say, okay, I think we've got some explanation. And if it doesn't, then you try something more complicated. So it is possible to model a scenario along the lines of what you're describing, where it is more or less hardwired, where individuals can recognize each other and can recognize levels of relatedness, not by a light bulb going off and saying, oh, I'm related, so therefore I will, cooperate more, but it being sort of baked into their behavioral programs in a kind of computer program like if-then sort of thing. Now, what makes it interesting is we can model that more simply without invoking consciousness, but we don't know really. That's the scientific answer. We have no evidence to know whether there isn't something more elaborate going on. The history of animal behavior is basically one of consistently underestimating animals and their abilities. Having said that, it is a very reasonable explanation to say in the case of honeybees that you do not need to invoke any higher level of cognition other than they can distinguish individuals based on how similar they are to each other in the case of honeybees, in their smells. And the more similar they are, the more cooperative behavior is elicited.
Yeah, that's something that you said that throughout the times, we always underestimate the nature of animals. And I remember last year reading this article how birds, they basically have this sort of quantum GPS way to do that. And perhaps there's something deeper about bees and how they interact that is interesting. But you mentioned consciousness, and there's this idea that there's some sort of a collective consciousness in the world, perhaps. How much do you think that's like? Did you see anything like that in your research with bees? Do you think there's some truth to that in our human civilization? This idea of having a human consciousness that are, like everything. It's kind of hard to explain, but this idea of a collective consciousness that, like, if you learn how to do X, Y, and Z, therefore it's easier for people in the future to do that. Mm-hmm. It's kind of a hard idea to explain, but do you think that's sort of true in our human civilization?
Well, there's no evidence for that.
Right.
And you are talking to a card-carrying, empirical, skeptical scientist. And so I would say that it's not something that is clear at all, is a necessary explanation for the phenomena that we see. So I'd be very skeptical about that.